This morning, Danny and I will be talking about his latest book, In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967 and the Hippie Idea, about which Wavy Gravy wrote, Danny Goldberg is a relentless tracker of people. However elusive this lost chord may be, Danny searches it out and nails it to the tree flesh. Eternity now, 1967, forever. So as we descend into the mists of time, I invite our own Virgil, Danny Goldberg, to please come forward and guide us back to 1967. So you graduated from the Ethical Culture Fieldston School in 1967.
Barely.
We have a lot in common. I graduated from high school in 1967 from Brooklyn Prep. I know what my high school was like. What was it like for you at the Ethical Culture School?
Oh, well, I guess I had what today they call ADD. So I just had a really hard time with teachers. And most of the teachers there, I felt were, I'm not proud of this, but that's how I felt at the time. But I'll tell you, there were two teachers that were nice to me. One was Mr. Worthman, the music teacher, and the other was Dr. Spetter, the ethics teacher. And boy, what a good advertisement he was for the values of this institution and this tradition. You know, he was really a loving, open-minded, and brilliant person. So, other than that, what I mostly remember, the kids I went to school with, I always really felt I got my education from them.
Sure.
And I mentioned some of them actually in the books. It was quite an extraordinary time, as you know, to be going to school and to be a teenager. It's such an honor to be here. I mean, the values of this place.
So in the book, you called it In Search of the Lost Chord, and I have to say I like the UK cover better. Okay, I did, but this is the one selling in the United States. 1967 and the hippie idea. Can you define the hippie idea for us so we know what?
Well, it's funny. I coined that phrase, such as it is, after one of my classmates, Gil Scott Heron, passed away a few years ago. He graduated from Fieldston, as many of you may know, and he was one of the great American poets, songwriters, and artists, one of the progenitors of hip-hop, and he was also an amazingly cool kid in high school. And the reason I said the hippie idea is to try to refer to sort of the essence of the feeling and the inchoate set of values that I was inspired by and that I think millions of people were at the time, differentiating it from the external symbols like, language like car out man and, the tie-dyed shirts or beads or long hair, things that were quickly drained of meaning by media exposure and by predators. I mean, one year you'd see somebody with long hair walking down the street with his brother, and the next year it's an FBI agent or Charles Manson. Mm-hmm. So, these external symbols were drained of meaning and became actually fodder for satire and contempt. And I understand, I always said if I was 10 years younger, I'm sure I would have identified with the punk generation that had contempt for what they thought hippies were. But I'm in an age where I remember the feeling behind it, which to me was what the Greeks call agape, to really try to love everybody, to really try to see if one could be part of a movement that would change the world for the better. And it didn't change a lot of things, but it was a sincere effort in the context of thousands of years of human history. I think it was as good a period as any other. And so that was what sort of informed the rest of my life, and I think informed the culture today, was that set of values behind the externals. And so hence the gimmicky phrase, hippie idea.
Okay. It's also called In Search of the Lost Chord. Why the Lost Chord? Is that?
Well, there were a lot of things going on at the same time over the course of what we call the 60s. And a lot of what's remembered, of course, are the protests against the war in Vietnam, the explosive period in race relations, the assassinations of Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, psychedelics, but also heroin, optimism, but also self-destructiveness. And there were a lot of tensions even in the moment between people that identified first as sort of in a spiritual way, maybe influenced by psychedelics. A number of people define define themselves primarily as political radicals. I mean, Tom Hayden, who's a great hero of mine and who I talked to for the book, who's one of the first presidents of SDS, as far as I know, never took psychedelics and was quite dubious about the whole hippie enterprise. And there were a lot of people on the other side of the community, somebody like Tim Leary, that kind of had contempt for political activism because he thought it, or even Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, extremely dubious about organized political activism. But to me, as a kid, growing up when you did, I didn't process all of these things individually. I got kind of the group of all of these things, the Beatles talking about meditation, Stokely Carmichael coining the phrase Black Power, Muhammad Ali not only being the greatest fighter of his generation, but then giving up his championship because he didn't want to serve in the war in Vietnam. Some of the SDS thinkers and academics that articulated the case against the war, and poets like Allen Ginsberg, and the music of the Beatles and the San Francisco Sound. And the combination of these things, to me, in '67 had a sweetness that was lost by the next year. That the dark forces took over. The balance went more towards heroin and less towards psychedelics, more towards violence and less towards peace and love. And so there was a combination of bohemian traditions that had been going on for hundreds of years, new technology, music, and a lot of other things that, to me, created a conceit of the idea of chord means many notes together. It created a feeling that, to me, at least externally, is lost, but for those of us who remember it, it's something to aspire to. And I just needed a book title.
Okay,
you know, I was originally going to call it Was 50 Years Ago Today, as a riff on the Sgt. Pepper's thing, and I noticed whenever I mentioned it to people under 50, they had no idea what the reference was. So I just went through looking for song titles, because that's often a good source of book titles, and the Moody Blues did write an album,
right.
Had an album by that title. It came out, I think, in '67 or '68, and I don't really write much about the Moody Blues. I sort of have one sentence about them because I didn't want to totally diss them since I stole the title from them. But, it's the title that I came up with on deadlines.
But you did this guy from the Rascals, Cornish. You said that you did that in...
Well, I think that's in my other
in
book.
Your other book, yeah. Okay, that was for dissing. This book is not dissing. What I thought, let's get back to Search for the Lost Chord. I took the title when I first saw it to be sort of your Abyssinian maid with a dulcimer from Coleridge, that if you could just remember that chord that was playing, or if we all could remember that chord that was playing, we could get back to that idea.
Well, that was sort of part of it, yeah. I mean, that's definitely, what were the ideals? What was the aspiration? It's so hard to get in touch with that as one gets older, and but that's the job. That's the job of groups like this, and so I was interested in understanding historically what was going on that made me feel that way, instead of being, that there was this alternative way of looking at what it was to be a human being, separate from how much money you made or what your grades were, or things like that. There was some other thing. And some of it was just escapism, but some of it was genuine idealism and part of kind of a non-denominational spiritual counterpoint to materialism, which really was, to me then, as now, unfortunately, the dominant belief system of America.
In January of 1967 in San Francisco, it was the gathering of tribes, the human being, which got these groups of disparate people together to have this. And what shocked me about it, in reading about it in your book and then looking at the 3 posters that I was able to find of it, it wasn't really about music. I had always thought it had been about music, and they got at the bottom of the poster said all San Francisco rock bands. So it was much more spiritual and political. So can you talk about the meetings that led up to that being and what it was about?
Yeah, I did a thing like this in San Francisco over the summer. Part of the timing of the book is the 50th anniversary of all these things. And one of the things is the so-called Summer of Love. Summer of Love in '67 was really a media creation. The real Summer of Love was in '66, before the media was paying attention to Haight-Ashbury. So say people that were there, and I think they're they're right. And there was this community because the rents were low, and San Francisco had a history of encouraging creativity, and it's where Allen Ginsberg had first read Howl, and a lot of other things had happened. History of political radicalism as well. This neighborhood called Haight-Ashbury became home to 10,000 or so people that were really trying to rethink what America was, and it was certainly very influenced by the availability of psychedelics as well. And there were a number of the bands that later became very famous lived in Haight-Ashbury. The Jefferson Airplane lived there. Janis Joplin and her group Big Brother, the holding company, lived there, and the Grateful Dead lived there, and they were doing free shows constantly in the Bay Area almost every weekend, as were some other bands such as Country Joe and the Fish. Steve Miller's blues band, he later became a big pop artist, but he was really part of that San Francisco culture too, and a lot of others whose names are lost to the sands of time. But the idea for the Be-In came in October of '66, which was when LSD was made illegal in the state of California. And there was some event in Haight-Ashbury acknowledging that. I think it was October 6, 1966, 6/6/66. And Richard Alpert, who later became known as Ram Dass, and Alan Cohen, who was the editor of The Oracle, which was the big newspaper documenting what was going on in Haight-Ashbury, had this conversation about that it would be good to do something that would be more inclusive, that would include the political radicals, that would include the entire Bay Area, and they came up with this notion called Gathering of the Tribes, because it was very tribal. These different groups that to the right wing or the establishment might look all the same were quite different and quite separate from each other, and in many cases didn't particularly like each other. So they had a meeting at the Jefferson Airplane House, and Jerry Rubin, one of the Berkeley radicals, came and said, okay, this is a great idea. We're going to get all these people together. What are going to be our demands? And I think one of the members of the airplane said, man, it's a Be-In. There's no demands. So, but they let Jerry Rubin speak, and the idea of that particular event, and this was not replicated in later Be-Ins, which didn't have a program. The New York one didn't have any program at all. The LA one just had music. They had a program, and at the center of it was the one person of prominence who was accepted by political radicals, by psychedelic warriors, by the musicians, by Buddhists, by anyone in the counterculture, and that was Allen Ginsberg, who was older. He was in his early 40s at that time, I think. But unlike Jack Kerouac of the Beats, who hated the hippies, Ginsberg really recognized what this new energy was, embraced it, and he had taken LSD with Ken Kesey and with Tim Leary. He was friends with the Beatles and with Bob Dylan, and he had Howl, which he had read just 10-minute taxi drive away from where the Be-In was, 10 years earlier or 12 years earlier, was one of the key cultural moments that led up to the hippies. There would be no hippies without the beatniks, So he kind of presided over this, and then there were different speakers, artists and poets and mystics of all sorts, and then the bands played. Okay. And there's no question that the Grateful Dead, who were kind of the culminated, were a draw. But it attracted 40 or 50,000 people, and no previous gathering or dance or free show had done more than 1/10 that amount. So it was a dramatic moment in the expansion of the visible counterculture, and it was heavily documented by the media. That everybody had hundreds of people with cameras, and the publicity from that is what really then created the atmosphere for what was then called the Summer of Love, which was the influx in the summer of '67 of something like 100,000 young people into Haight-Ashbury, which totally destroyed the fragile countercultural essence of it, but which also magnified it.
Okay, two of the people who were at that meeting and who you write about were bringers of Eastern philosophy to the West. And you knew both Ram Dass and Ginsberg. What did they give to us?
Well, Ram Dass is still alive, so I would like to say I still know him. He's living in Maui, and still doing amazing work. And I urge everybody to check out the website, with what he puts up there, and he does these video, he's confined to a wheelchair, so he doesn't leave, but he'll still do lectures that they put up online and so on and so on. And Alan unfortunately died in his early 70s, but I was lucky enough to get to know him and make some recordings with him during the last years of his life. However, in this rambling answer, I forgot what your question was.
My question was, is they were bringers of Eastern philosophy to the West.
Yeah.
And what is their legacy of doing that?
Well, there had been interest in the West and Eastern philosophy for a while. I think Swami Vivekananda came in the early part of the 20th century to some Chicago expo, and Paramahansa Yogananda came in the 1940s. And in terms of Buddhism, Alan Watts had been long writing about Buddhism and had a radio show in San Francisco, I think, since the 1950s. And so it wasn't completely new to the West, but it was confined to small enclaves of sort of intellectuals or people in neighborhoods like Greenwich Village. It was a small cluster of, like a cult following, without the pejorative meaning of the word cult, that a small number of people had. And the thing about the 60s culture was that it took that energy, which had existed again. You could go back to Emerson and Thoreau, you could go back to almost any century, Theosophy, and see esoteric ideas, many of which came from the East. But the thing about the 60s was that those ideas then collided into a mass media moment and became part of the mass culture. And so all over the world, people who were Beatles fans were hearing about meditation. This was a word that no one had ever heard of unless you were in a monastery or a zendo somewhere or a theology student, and suddenly it's on the front page of tabloids. And Ginsberg was certainly somebody who went from the intellectual traditions of poetry to an embrace of and an interest in both Hinduism and Buddhism, as Kerouac did too. Kerouac wrote a book about the life of Buddha that's, one of the easiest ones to read. And he could write, whether he liked hippies or not. And so that was certainly part of Ginsberg's work. He was such a complicated and long career, and he did so many things. But the Hare Krishna mantra, which is kind of became this famous thing, and it's in movies, and was popularized by a holy man named Bhaktivedanta, who came to the Lower East Side around in '67, I believe, or '66 or '67. He was 70 years old, didn't know anyone here. Started going to Tompkins Square Park with this tiny group of students chanting, and then Ginsberg passed by, started chanting with him. A month later, the New York Times does a story about it because Ginsberg is there. Mm-hmm. And by the next year, George Harrison of the Beatles has issued a recording of the Hare Krishna mantra. In terms of Ram Dass, he, along with Timothy Leary, were Harvard professors. He was then called Richard Alpert. Leary was sort of his mentor, but they both were thrown out for giving psychedelics to undergraduates, become very famous as sort of popularizers of LSD. Once it was made illegal, it was much easier to get. That's how prohibition works. And he, in '67 is the year that he decides that psychedelics are not enough. He wrote a book called Be Here Now, which I bet a lot of people here have read, and certainly a big inspiration to me, where he explains the limits of satisfaction of being a professor and aggregating material things. And then he becomes the psychedelics guy and an integral part of the Haight-Ashbury community. And then felt, as he said, the problem with LSD was that you always kept coming down, and that it wasn't giving a permanent change of consciousness. And he had, Aldous Huxley had talked to Leary and Albert before he died about the connectivity between Eastern spiritual traditions and the psychedelic experience, and that's how they came to translate the Tibetan Book of the Dead as sort of this LSD guide. And so based on Huxley's thoughts about the matter, Alpert goes to India, meets a guru named Karoli Baba, and changes his name to Ram Dass, and becomes an important spiritual teacher in the West to this day. And I think that small group of people are the seeds of what gives us a yoga place in every small town and village, and veggie burgers and alternative medicine and mindfulness and a lot of other things that would be completely alien to American culture, earlier in the 60s and are now ubiquitous.
Sure. We had a meeting here last week, Tuesday evening. John Kabat-Zinn, Dan Goldman, and Richard Davidson were downstairs in the big hall,
Right.
filled up with 800 people.
Well, they're famous people.
Well, they are famous people, as you are, but they are famous people.
I'm happy with this crowd.
They are famous people who come off of that tree. I mean,
Well, Dan Goldman for sure was in India with Ram Dass.
I've always been leery of Timothy Leary, but you write about him in a very soft and gentle way, and I may have to reassess.
He's a complicated life. I only got to know him in the 80s. He was long past being a media celebrity. He was living in LA and sort of an elder statesman, and just to me and to the people I saw around him in those years of his life was just a sweet guy, still very smart, still intensely curious about anything new. He was a big early embracer of artificial intelligence and the internet and things like that, a mentor to a lot of rock musicians of subsequent generations, and just somebody to me that was just a loving, positive person. He certainly was controversial. I remember as a kid, I was not a big fan of his because I'd see him on TV, he seemed like he was proselytizing, and I just had a real resistance to anyone selling anything, even LSD,
Right.
and it always seemed a little slightly oily to me.
Right.
So I became somebody who really got to like him personally later in his life, but understand your resistance to him, because I myself was not I liked LSD, but I wasn't like, a Leary groupie, and he'd make these records that seemed a little contrived to me and so on and so forth. But I think that if you look really in retrospect at his contribution, it's pretty impressive. There are definitely people that don't like him. I mean, Peter Coyote, who somebody else I interviewed for the book, who's an extremely compelling part of the 60s. He was part of the Diggers, which were a very influential radical group in Haight-Ashbury, and he's written 2 very intelligent memoirs about the period. Has great anger still at Leary because he feels that Leary turned people in, after to get out of jail early. There are people that thought that he was a distraction to the overall kind of political goals of the movement by some of the extreme things he would say, and
That
he was certainly
CIA.
a flawed person. I don't think there's any possibility that he.
No, but that rumor was out there that he was there to get everybody on LSD so they would stop being radical.
There's no question that LSD was introduced in part to America by the CIA. I mean, that's how Ken Kesey,
Right.
who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and who was the subject of Tom Wolfe's book, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, first took it in a overtly CIA-sponsored program because they thought it was like a mind control drug. But the idea that it was then sort of that people like me and all my friends were manipulated by the CIA into tripping so that we wouldn't oppose the war is ridiculous. First of all, everybody I knew who took acid was against the war.
Exactly.
And secondly, I only wish they were that fucking effective. If they were, we might have a little different president right now.
All right.
So, but I think that there's no question there were tensions that again, Hayden and a lot of the political people really resented the psychedelics movement and thought it was a distraction. But the idea that they were going to take some Marxist philosophy and magically capture a governing majority of America through the academic explanations of Marxism as expressed in their position papers is delusional. Rock and roll and psychedelics broadened the movement. It didn't sabotage it, but it's very hard to take on one's government in time of war. No one's ever successfully done it to my knowledge, and I just think it was a lot of things going on at the same time, and but as far as Tim goes, he was ubiquitous at that time. There's no question about that. He was at the Be-In. He was doing these theatrical productions. He was befriending John Lennon. He was, he was a character in the conversation that was going on. And, sometimes he said really smart things and sometimes he didn't. But, I describe a meeting that happened after the be-in at on Alan Watts's houseboat that was, again, the guy from the Oracle was kind of the playing your role, the MC of the thing. And it was Ginsberg, Leary, Alan Watts, and I guess Alan Cohen. I think those just discussing. And during all of it, at the be-in, Tim had popularized something that he'd started saying a couple of months earlier, which is this phrase, turn on, tune in, drop out. And if you go on Tim Leary's Wikipedia page, it's one of the first things that pops out. It's probably the phrase he was best known for. And he cooked it up after a lunch with Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian academic who was quite a bit older, but who was this, media genius, really the one who popularized a lot of ideas about what media was in that television age. And he was very into the idea of slogans. So during this summit, Ginsberg periodically keeps saying, Tim, everywhere I go, people don't know what you mean by turn on, tune in, drop out. Like, drop out of what? You're not dropping out of anything. And he's hectoring him all through this about how this phrase is very confusing to young people and they don't know what to do, and that he's got plenty of money, that he can make a living being Tim Leary, but a typical teenager can't do that, and that it was being perceived as undermining the activism. And so finally at the end of it, Tim says, I make a lot of mistakes. only half of what I say is worth remembering, and maybe we should change it.
Yeah, okay.
And that was a side of him that I knew.
Thank you for that. The same summer of love that the hippies were having in San Francisco and in New York and in LA was also a summer of rebellion in the black neighborhoods.
Yeah, worst racial disturbances in America since the Civil War, and maybe ever. I mean, there's this movie Detroit came out this summer about the Detroit. I haven't seen it, but it documents, I think, 40 or 50 people killed in what they call the riot in Detroit, Newark, dozens of people, Milwaukee, Buffalo. It was, as they say, a long, hot summer. It was a convulsive time in race relations. Dr. King was still alive. 67 was his last full year of life, and he was doing amazing work. To go back and read what he was saying in that last year of his life is so radical and so sophisticated, and a little different from the kind of sound bites that we get every year on his birthday, even though those are good sound bites.
Sure.
But and it was the year that Stokely Carmichael emerged as head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he was neither a student nor nonviolent, and changed that organization and coined the phrase Black Power. Right. And it was by the end of the year the Black Panthers had emerged onto the stage of American conversation, and Huey Newton had been arrested, and Free Huey became, again, a cry on college campuses in African American neighborhoods, and there was tremendous frustration. The Great Society programs just didn't change things quickly enough. The frustration of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation was just so painful, and it was a time of great upheaval and violence, and the government didn't help. J. Edgar Hoover is one of the real villains in American history, in my opinion, and viciously went after both the people in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement with encouragement, in my opinion, from President Johnson. And so it was a lot of, it wasn't all peace and love. People act sometimes, when I talk to people today who are so understandably freaked out by some of the things happening in our government today, as if that was some innocent, easy time. It wasn't. The people that were talking about peace and love were doing so in the context of a vicious war that was killing, people every week, and every young male under 35 or 40 was subject to the draft, with racial disturbances, with a vicious FBI, with a crazy president. Literally, both Bill Moyers and Richard Goodwin, who worked for President Johnson, consulted psychiatrists to find out if they thought the president was actually so mentally unstable he shouldn't serve. Sounds kind of familiar.
Yeah, I was looking at the timeline in the back of your book.
Yeah.
And the timeline is just incredible. The amount of things upon things upon things that were happening. I took June, and there's like 1,000 things happening
I know.
in June. And I read it to my wife, who said it sounds just like today, where we're talking, what did Trump do today? What did the thing do today? And the hurricane here today. So Martin Luther King at that time was beginning to connect the dots. He was against the war. He was turning into a pro-union man, and he was transforming himself into this. And today, there are organizations or leaders in organizations that are starting to work together, going through that same transformation to make that environmental justice is jobs justice, is gentrification justice, and so these voices are again rising, and we have new media, social media. And there was new media in '67. You talk about the East Village Other and the Oracle as newspapers. You talk about underground radio of the rock stations, and Bob Fass and Steve Post on WBAI. And how did you get to stay up so late all the time listening to Fass?
Well, because there were, technology was definitely part of what made the 60s the 60s. And there were a few different things that came along around that time. And one of them was the transistor radio.
Yes.
And I could put it under my pillow. And my parents didn't know that I was listening to the radio. So that's how I did it, you know.
Okay. You also mentioned the TV show of Alan Burke. You also mentioned, and it was very interesting that he and Joe Pine. Right? People remember Joe Pine. It was Saturday and Sunday nights on Channel 5. And Alan Burke had on such a great cast of people. And I never agreed with Alan Burke. I always agreed with the people he had on. He had Baraka on. He had Brother Theodore on. He had lots and lots of interesting people.
Well, and William Buckley also, Firing Line, emerges around the same time.
Yeah, and I always
the same
agreed.
thing,
Yeah.
you would watch to disagree with Buckley, not to agree with him. But there's a fantastic show Allen Ginsberg did with Buckley that's you can get it online or DVD or whatever. They're all available. You know, that's one of the good things about the modern world. That's and you can see at one point Allen reads a poem and Buckley just melts because he wanted to hate him, but he couldn't because of the brilliance involved. But he had no problem hating Eldridge Cleaver and some of the other people he had on.
Sure. Is there hope in 1917? Is there something that had come down?
1917 was a rough year.
18 was worse because there was the flu. So 2017.
I know when I walked in tonight, or this
Today,
morning,
here we go.
This morning I saw the big photo of Algernon Black with Eleanor Roosevelt, which made me, kvel. And then there's this picture of Woodrow Wilson, who I have extremely mixed feelings about. But apparently he did one good thing. I guess he ended child labor, but
he died too.
He was not one of the great ones.
Right.
But 2017, look, there's I think there's always hope, and I think it's very important not to romanticize the past. There's a sense of sort of, this is the worst time ever, this is the worst president ever. And, it is worse in the sense that it's right now. So right now, God forbid there could be a nuclear war, the climate is out of control, and there's a level of crudity and cruelty to vulnerable people that it's very painful to witness coming from leading figures. But on the other hand, we've had a lot of dreadful presidents in this country. We've had a lot of bad policies. I mean, we had slavery. We had women not being able to vote. We had Jim Crow. We've had terrible things that have happened over the course of the time that this country has existed. And somehow people like the people in this room and like great figures like Dr. King have been able to shine a light. And I believe there are people today shining a light. I tend to look towards young people as the way to go.
Sure.
They usually lead us, and
Sure.
our job is to support the best of them. But I think, all you can do is do the best you can. That's what people here have done ever since this place started. And there are some things that are worse today and some things that are better, but, be here now.
Thank you for that. I have one final question, which is three-part, that has nothing to do with your book, and you may not know the answers right away.
Okay.
What was the first record you bought, whether it be a single or an album?
There was before I smoked dope,
Yes.
what I listened to was classical music.
Okay.
And I was really a fan. I couldn't play anything. I was very uncoordinated then as now. But I loved Vladimir Horowitz.
Okay.
And so I think the first classical album I bought was Horowitz Plays Scarlatti. Once I smoked dope,
Yes.
my interest in classical music took a bit of a back seat, although I still honor it and listen to it sometimes today. And in the rock pantheon, it was definitely Phil Oak's All the News That's Fit to Sing.
Yes. Yes.
Was the game changer for me.
All right. All right. What was the best concert you ever went to? And you've been to a bunch. Do you have? If you don't have one, you can pass.
Oh man, there have been so many memorable ones. I just don't know how to single one out. But I am grateful I got to see Jimi Hendrix play a few times, and that's a big one. And certainly the first time I saw Janis Joplin, when I first got out to Northern California, I'd never heard of her, was a big one.
Right.
But those are just what's popping to mind.
And last, can you think of the strangest double bill you saw?
Well, the strangest double bill I ever heard of
Yes.
was Jimi Hendrix opening for the
The
Monkees.
I was there.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah.
Forest Hills Tennis Stadium. The
God bless
the
you.
strangest double bill. I have a double bill that was stranger than that. I had Jerry Jeff Walker with David Bromberg acoustic opening for the Mothers of Invention.
Good.
Who would put that together?
Very good. Well, I don't know. Later on in my life, I was lucky enough to manage the band Nirvana.
Yes.
And they were on a TV show in England where the guy that came on before was Monsieur Mange Tout, who was a guy who ate metal. And they gave
Was
him
it
an
heavy
alarm
metal?
clock. No, an alarm clock. And he ate the alarm clock, and then Nirvana had to come out and play Smells Like Teen Spirit. So that wasn't a concert, but it was a bizarre juxtaposition.
It is bizarre. Thank you for being here, Danny Goldberg.
Oh.
In Search of the Lost Chord. Would you please that way?